The sun was already dipping behind the western hills, painting the sky in soft orange and purple. Dust still clung to the cowboy's boots as he walked toward the small fire he had built for the night. His horse was tied to a tree nearby, quietly chewing on dry grass. It had been a long day of riding, checking on the herd, and making sure no rustlers were sneaking close. He was tired, his back ached, and all he wanted was a quiet meal before laying down under the stars. He bent down near the fire and stirred the pot where beans had been slowly cooking. The smell of supper gave him a little comfort. Out here in the wide empty land, a warm meal meant more than just food. It meant survival. The cowboy reached for a piece of bread he had kept wrapped in a cloth and set it beside the pot. Just as he leaned back, something caught his eye, a quick shadow, small but fast, slipping from behind the brush near his camp. At first he thought it was a stray animal, maybe a coyote trying its luck. But then he noticed a thin hand reach for the bread. The cowboy moved quick, his instincts sharp from years on the trail. He caught the wrist of the intruder before the bread could disappear, and when he looked closer, his heart froze. It wasn't a thief with a gun, it was a girl. She couldn't have been more than 12 or 13. Her dress was torn at the seams, the color faded from too much dust and sun. Her shoes were worn thin, almost falling apart. She had a wild look in her eyes. The look of someone who had gone too long without safety or kindness. She tried to twist her wrist free, but the cowboy didn't squeeze hard. He just held her steady, staring in disbelief. "What are you doing, little one?" His voice came out rough but not unkind. The girl didn't answer. Her lips trembled, and she glanced at the bread again, her hunger stronger than her fear. The cowboy could see the dirt on her face, her tangled hair, and the sharp bones pressing against her skin. She looked as though a strong wind might blow her away. He let go of her wrist slowly. Instead of running, she stood frozen like a deer trapped in the open. The cowboy sighed and picked up the bread she had tried to take. He broke it in half and held out a piece to her. For a long moment she didn't move. Then, almost too fast to see, she grabbed it and began eating, her small hand shaking as she tore into it. The cowboy sat back on the log near the fire, watching her. She chewed quickly, as if afraid someone might take the bread away again. He saw her eyes dart toward the pot of beans, then back at him. Her hunger was louder than any words she might have spoken. "Sit down," he said softly, nodding toward the fire. She hesitated, but finally lowered herself onto the ground, still keeping a bit of distance. The cowboy scooped some beans into a tin bowl and set it near her. At first she looked at him as if it were a trick. When he gave her a small nod, she picked it up and ate, every bite fast and desperate. The night grew quieter. Crickets sang in the grass, and the fire snapped with little sparks. The cowboy didn't ask many questions at first. He knew that sometimes silence was easier for the broken and lost, but he kept watching her carefully. She was too thin, too young to be out here alone, and the way she hunched over the bowl told him she had not eaten properly in days, maybe longer. After a while, she slowed down, her hunger giving way to tiredness. She wiped her mouth with the back of her hand and finally looked at him. Her eyes were big, dark, and filled with something heavier than just fear. "What's your name?" the cowboy asked. For a moment, she seemed ready to stay silent again. Then, in a small voice, she whispered, "Clara." The cowboy repeated it softly, almost to himself. "Clara." It was a gentle name, not one that belonged to a thief or a runaway. "Where's your family, Clara?" he asked carefully. Her eyes dropped to the dirt and her shoulders tightened. She didn't answer, and he didn't push her. The firelight danced between them, painting her face with shadows. The cowboy could see there was a story behind her silence, a story that weighed too much for her small frame. He leaned back, pulled out another piece of bread from the cloth, and chewed slowly. His own hunger didn't seem so strong anymore. Watching Clara had stirred something inside him, something he hadn't felt in a long time. He remembered his younger days, the nights when he too had gone without food, when kindness from a stranger had felt like a miracle. Clara hugged the empty tin bowl to her chest, as though it was her treasure. She didn't ask for more, though the cowboy could tell she wanted it. Instead, she glanced toward the dark line of the trees, her body stiffening as though someone or something waited out there. "You alone?" the cowboy asked again, gentle but firm. Clara's lips parted as if she wanted to speak, but fear held her voice back. The cowboy didn't miss the way her small hands gripped the bowl tighter, the way her eyes darted again to the shadows. He understood then that she wasn't just a hungry child, she was hiding something. Maybe someone was waiting for her. Maybe her story was darker than he could guess. Still, he didn't press. He knew trust wasn't built in an hour, so he threw another log on the fire, letting the flames rise and push back the night. "You can stay here tonight," he said. "No one will bother you." Clara's head snapped up, her eyes searching his face. She seemed unsure whether to believe him, yet the warmth of the fire, the safety of the circle of light, and the fullness of her stomach pulled her closer to sleep. Slowly, she curled up on the ground, her head resting on her arms. The cowboy stayed awake a while longer, watching the stars come out one by one. The wide Wild West stretched silent around them, full of dangers both seen and unseen. He looked at the fragile figure lying near his fire and felt a weight settle in his chest. He didn't know her story yet, but he knew enough to understand she was no thief by choice. She was a survivor. As the fire crackled and the coyotes howled in the distance, the cowboy whispered to himself, "What happened to you, little one?" Clara didn't answer. She was already asleep. But the cowboy knew that when she woke, her story would come piece by piece. And he wasn't sure his heart was ready for what he might hear. The fire had burned low during the night, leaving only glowing coals and a soft warmth that pushed against the cold air. The cowboy stretched his legs and rubbed his eyes as dawn painted the horizon in pale light. He wasn't sure when he had drifted off, but when he opened his eyes, the girl was still there, curled up near the fire like a stray kitten who had found shelter. Her chest rose and fell in slow breaths, and her small face looked softer in the morning light. For the first time, she seemed less like a thief and more like a child who had been running too long. The cowboy stood slowly, careful not to wake her. He moved toward his horse, checked the saddle, and made sure his gear was in place. The world out here never stopped being dangerous, and he had to be ready. When he came back, Clara was awake. She sat up quickly, her arms wrapped tightly around her knees as though she expected him to be angry that she was still there. "Mornin'," the cowboy said in his calm, steady voice. Clara didn't reply, but her eyes followed him as he crouched near the fire and began preparing a bit of breakfast. He poured some coffee into a tin cup and warmed up the leftover beans. The smell of food drifted through the cool morning air, and Clara's stomach growled loudly, breaking the silence. Her face turned red, and she pulled her knees tighter, but the cowboy pretended not to notice. "You'll eat," he said firmly, handing her a piece of bread. This time she didn't hesitate. She took it with both hands, nibbling slowly. Though he could see she wanted to swallow it in one bite, he filled a second tin bowl with beans and passed it to her. She ate quietly, her eyes darting up at him every few moments as though checking if the kindness would suddenly end. The cowboy sipped his coffee and studied her. She was thin, far too thin, and her clothes told the story of weeks, maybe months of hardship. He could see tiny scars on her knuckles and dirt beneath her fingernails. She was no stranger to struggle. He also noticed the way her shoulders tensed every time the wind moved the grass or a bird took off suddenly. She lived like someone who had been taught to expect trouble at every turn. "What happened to you, Clara?" he asked in a low voice. She froze, her spoon halfway to her mouth. For a moment he thought she wouldn't answer. Then she set the bowl down carefully and looked at the ground. I didn't mean to steal," she whispered. Her voice was small, trembling like a leaf in the breeze. "I know," the cowboy replied. He didn't push further. He wanted her to keep talking on her own. Clara rubbed her thin hands together, her eyes still fixed on the dirt. "I was just hungry. I hadn't eaten in days. I thought if I could take your bread, maybe." She trailed off and shook her head, as if the rest of her words were too heavy to carry. The cowboy leaned back, his face unreadable beneath the brim of his hat. He let the silence stretch until she finally lifted her eyes, full of worry. "I wasn't going to hurt you," she added quickly. "I know that too," he said softly. She seemed surprised by his calmness. Most grown men she had met would have been angry, maybe worse. But this cowboy's voice held no anger, only curiosity and something that felt close to patience. When she finished eating, Clara sat with her hands in her lap, twisting the edge of her dress. The cowboy watched the nervous movement. He had seen it before in people who had lived too long in fear. "You've been alone a while?" he asked gently. Clara's lips pressed together. She looked away out toward the open land. For a long moment she didn't answer. Then she nodded, almost too small to notice. The cowboy knew there was more. There was always more. He remembered nights in his own youth when silence felt safer than truth. He also remembered how heavy the silence became when no one tried to understand. "You don't have to tell me everything today," he said at last, "but you should know you're safe here." The words seemed to shake her. She blinked at him as if unsure she had heard right. Safe was not a word she had known in a long time. The day grew brighter and the cowboy began packing his gear. Clara watched him closely, her body tense again as though she feared he might ride away and leave her behind. He saw the worry on her face and stopped what he was doing. "Where do you need to go?" he asked. Her lips parted, but she didn't speak right away. Then her eyes shifted toward the trees the same way they had last night. I can't leave my brother," she said at last. The cowboy straightened, his chest tightening. "You've got a brother out here?" Clara nodded quickly, fear flashing in her eyes as though she had revealed too much. "He's younger than me. I couldn't leave him alone. He's waiting for me, in a barn not far from here." The cowboy's breath came slow and heavy. He had wondered why her eyes always moved toward the shadows, why she never looked fully at ease. She wasn't just stealing for herself. She had someone depending on her. "That why you risked coming into my camp?" he asked. Tears shimmered in Clara's eyes, though she blinked them back. "I didn't know what else to do," she whispered. "He's so hungry. I had to bring him something." The cowboy looked at her for a long time, his rough face softening with each second. The image of a small boy, weak and starving in some lonely barn, burned into his mind. He understood then why Clara had been so desperate, why fear and hunger walked beside her. "You should have told me last night," he said gently. She shook her head quickly. "I didn't know if you'd believe me. People don't help us. They tell us to go away." The cowboy's jaw tightened. He knew she was telling the truth. The West was not kind to the weak, and children without family were often seen as a burden. Most folks turned their eyes away. He crouched down so that he was closer to her level. "Clara, I believe you. I believe every word. And I ain't the kind of man to leave a child starving in a barn." Her eyes widened, searching his face. She saw no trick in his expression, only the weight of honesty. For the first time, some of her fear seemed to ease. The cowboy poured the last of the beans into a cloth pouch and handed it to her. "Take this to your brother. I'll ride with you." Clara clutched the pouch tightly, her small fingers pressing into the fabric as if it was gold. For a moment, she just stared at him, her mouth opening but no words coming out. Then, in a shaky whisper, she said, "Thank you." The cowboy nodded once, pulling on his gloves. His horse snorted, ready for the trail. He felt the weight of a decision forming in his chest. He hadn't planned on this, but life out here rarely cared about plans. As Clara stood, holding the pouch to her chest, the cowboy thought about the way she had eaten, the scars on her hands, the fear in her eyes. He thought about the boy waiting in that barn, and he knew this was only the beginning of their story. The sun climbed higher, the morning quiet except for the sound of the cowboy tightening his saddle. Clara stood beside him, no longer a thief, but a sister carrying hope for her brother. The cowboy looked out at the endless land and muttered under his breath, "This is going to change everything." He didn't know yet just how much, but deep inside he could feel it. Her story was about to break his heart wide open. The trail stretched ahead, long and dusty as the cowboy led his horse by the reins. Clara walked a few steps behind him, clutching the pouch of beans tightly in her hands as though her whole world rested inside it. Her small feet stumbled now and then on rocks and roots, but she pushed forward with quiet determination. The morning sun was already rising higher, warming the land. But the girl's thin shoulders shivered as though she carried a chill from something deeper than the air. The cowboy didn't talk much as they moved along. He had learned that silence often gave frightened souls the space they needed. Every now and then, though, he would glance back at her. She looked so small, too small for the heavy story she carried. He could tell she was fighting against fear and exhaustion, but something in her eyes, something stubborn, kept her moving. After a while, Clara spoke in a voice so soft he almost didn't hear. "It's not far." The cowboy slowed his steps so she could walk beside him. "Good," he said simply. He didn't want to press her, but his heart was restless. He needed to know what kind of life had forced her into stealing food from strangers. As they neared a line of old cottonwood trees, Clara's eyes darted toward a broken-down fence in the distance. Her pace quickened, and the cowboy followed, his boots crunching in the dry grass. Soon a weathered barn came into view, its roof sagging and walls leaning like tired old men. The sight of it made the cowboy's chest tighten. This wasn't a safe shelter, it was barely standing. Clara ran ahead, calling out in a hushed voice, "Sam! Sam, it's me." The cowboy watched as a boy, younger than Clara, crept out from the shadows of the barn. He looked even thinner than his sister, his hair a tangled mess and his clothes ripped and too small for him. His bare feet were covered in dust and his face was pale. Still, when he saw Clara holding the pouch of food, his eyes lit up with relief. Clara dropped to her knees and hugged him tightly. "I brought something," she whispered, pressing the pouch into his hands. The boy clung to her, his small arms wrapping around her neck with desperate strength. The cowboy stood a few feet away, his hand resting on the saddle horn, watching the scene unfold. He had seen many things in his life, storms, stampedes, even men who didn't survive gunfights. But nothing struck him harder than the sight of these two children holding each other in a crumbling barn, their hunger and fear hidden only by the love they shared. After a moment, Clara looked back at the cowboy. Her eyes were full of unspoken questions. Would he stay? Would he help? Or would he walk away like so many others had? The cowboy walked forward slowly and tipped his hat to the boy. "Howdy, Sam," he said gently. Sam blinked up at him, holding on to Clara's arm. He didn't answer right away, but Clara whispered, "It's all right. He helped me. He's not like the others." The cowboy crouched down so he wasn't towering over them. "You've got a strong sister," he said to the boy. "She came all the way to my camp last night just to bring you food." Sam's lips curved into a small smile, weak but grateful. He opened the pouch and ate a few beans with shaking hands. Clara held his wrist gently, helping him. The cowboy felt a lump rise in his throat. He had known Clara's story would be heavy, but now, standing in front of Sam, he realized it was heavier than he imagined. These children were holding on to life by a thread, and that thread could snap at any moment. Clara sat beside her brother, brushing the dirt from his hair. Her voice was steady, though her eyes glistened. "Our family came west last year," she began, her words spilling out as if a door had finally opened. "Mama and Papa wanted a better life. They said there was land and work here. We traveled in a wagon with all we owned, but everything went wrong." The cowboy listened, his hands resting on his knees. Clara's voice shook as she continued. "Mama got sick on the trail. She was too weak to keep walking, and there was no doctor, no medicine. Papa tried to help her, but Clara's voice broke, and she pressed her face against her brother's hair. Sam closed his eyes, holding on to her tightly. The cowboy's chest ached. He had heard stories like this before, but hearing it from Clara in her trembling voice made it real in a way that no tale around a campfire ever could. "Papa tried to keep us safe after that," Clara whispered, her words cracking. "He worked where he could, but one night men came. They wanted money or food or both, I don't know. Papa tried to stop them and—" She paused, her throat tight. Finally, she forced the words out. "They hurt him. They left him, and we were alone after that." The cowboy shut his eyes for a moment, fighting the storm inside him. His fists curled not at the children, but at the cruelty of the world they had been thrown into. He wanted to know who those men were, but he kept his anger quiet. Clara didn't need anger. She needed someone who would listen. "We stayed in the wagon for a while," Clara said, her voice flat with exhaustion. "But the wheels broke and we had nowhere to go. We found this barn. It was empty, so we stayed. Some nights we got scraps from farms nearby, but mostly it's just been hunger." The cowboy felt as though the ground had dropped beneath him. The beans, the bread, those little things he had always taken for granted, meant survival to these children. Every bite was a victory. Clara looked at him then, her eyes red but strong. "That's why I took your bread. I wasn't trying to be bad. I just couldn't let Sam—" She couldn't finish, but the meaning was clear. She couldn't let her brother starve. The cowboy swallowed hard, his throat burning. He wanted to say something, but words felt too small against the weight of her story. All he could manage was, "You did what you had to do." Sam leaned against Clara, his small face already brighter from the little food he had eaten. The cowboy could see how much he depended on her, how much she had carried on her thin shoulders. She wasn't just a sister. She was mother, father, protector, and provider all at once. The cowboy stood slowly, looking around the broken barn. The roof leaked, the walls had holes, and the place smelled of old hay. It was no home for two children. He rubbed his jaw, thinking hard. He had lived a life where he only looked out for himself, but suddenly that didn't seem enough. Clara's story had cut into him deeper than he expected. He thought of the kindness once shown to him when he was young, and he realized he had been given a chance to return that kindness now. He looked down at the siblings, their thin bodies huddled together, and whispered, "No one should have to go through this, not you. Not him." Clara's eyes widened slightly as though she didn't dare believe someone might finally stay instead of walk away. The cowboy knew then that his quiet life was over. He couldn't leave them to fate. Their story had broken something inside him, but in that breaking, it had also planted something new, a promise. And as the wind rustled the dry grass outside, he felt it deep in his bones. He was about to change their story just as they had changed his. The cowboy stood in the doorway of the broken barn for a long while, his shadow stretching across the dusty floor. He could hear the faint breathing of the children behind him, the tired sound of two young souls who had carried too much weight for too long. Clara sat close to Sam, one arm wrapped around him protectively as though she feared that even in this moment of rest someone might try to take him away. The boy's eyes were closed, his small body leaning into her side, too weak to do anything else. The cowboy looked around the barn again. The walls were splintered and full of holes, letting in streaks of sunlight that cut across the hay. The roof sagged, ready to give way with one strong storm. A chill blew through the gaps, even though the day outside was warm. This place had been abandoned by the world, and yet it had become the only home these children had left. His heart ached as he thought about it. He pulled his hat lower, trying to quiet the storm in his chest. He had always lived a life of his own, moving cattle, riding alone, never worrying about anyone except himself. But looking at Clara and Sam, something inside him shifted. He remembered nights from his own boyhood when hunger gnawed at his stomach and loneliness kept him awake. He remembered a stranger once giving him a loaf of bread and a place to sleep. That kindness had stayed with him all these years. And now here he was, facing two children who needed more than bread. They needed someone to care. Clara looked up at him, her eyes sharp and worried. She seemed afraid he would leave now that he had heard her story. She pressed her lips together and held Sam tighter. The cowboy knelt down beside them, his voice steady but soft. "You've been strong," he said. "Stronger than most grown folks I've known." Clara blinked, surprised by his words. She had been called many things in her short life, but strong was not one of them. "But you can't keep doing this alone," he added, his gaze shifting from her to the sleeping boy. "He needs more than scraps, and you need more than fear to live on." Tears welled in her eyes, though she tried to hide them. "What else can we do?" she whispered. "No one helps us. They tell us to go away. We're just two kids to them. Nobody wants us." The cowboy's chest tightened. He hated the truth in her words. The West was harsh and mercy was often in short supply, but he also knew he couldn't walk away. "You got me now," he said firmly. Clara's eyes widened, her lips parting in disbelief. She searched his face, waiting for the trick, waiting for the moment he would laugh or take the words back. But the cowboy's face was calm and steady, full of a promise he hadn't even planned to make but felt deep in his bones. "You mean, you'll stay?" she asked carefully. "I mean, I ain't leaving you here," he answered. "Not in this barn. Not like this." For the first time, Clara let out a shaky breath that wasn't weighed down by fear. A small, fragile hope flickered in her eyes. The cowboy stood and walked back to his horse. He dug through his saddlebags and pulled out a blanket, an extra canteen of water, and a small bag of dried meat. He brought them inside and laid them gently beside Clara. "This ain't much," he admitted, "but it'll keep you both going till we figure something better." Clara touched the blanket, her fingers trembling as if it were treasure. She wrapped it around Sam, who stirred in his sleep but didn't wake. The cowboy leaned against the wall, folding his arms. His mind raced with questions. Where could he take them? Who could he trust to help? The nearest town was rough, full of men who looked after themselves and didn't spare kindness for strangers. Ranchers out here weren't much better. He thought about the journey, about the dangers on the trail, and about how little he truly had to offer. He wasn't rich. He wasn't powerful. He was just one man with a horse, a rifle, and the will to keep moving. But as he watched the siblings huddle together, he realized that might be enough, for now. Clara broke the silence. "Why are you helping us?" The cowboy looked at her, his eyes shadowed by the brim of his hat. "Because once someone helped me. I was about your age when I lost everything. A stranger gave me food, gave me a chance to live another day. I never forgot it. And I reckon it's my turn to do the same. Her throat tightened, but she nodded, holding back tears. She didn't have words to answer him, but the look in her eyes spoke louder than anything. As the day wore on, the cowboy began patching what he could in the barn. He stuffed hay in the bigger holes in the walls, dragged broken boards to lean against the weakest spots, and cleared a place where the children could lie down without the draft cutting through. Clara watched him work, her small face puzzled. She wasn't used to seeing someone do so much for her without asking anything in return. When evening came, the cowboy cooked what little he had left over the small fire outside. He split the food 3 ways, giving the largest share to Sam. The boy was awake now, his eyes still tired but brighter after eating. He stared at the cowboy with quiet curiosity, not fully trusting but no longer afraid. Later, when the stars came out, Clara sat beside the cowboy near the fire. Sam was already asleep under the blanket, his chest rising and falling in steady rhythm. The night was cool and the fire's glow painted their faces in warm light. Clara spoke softly, almost to herself. Sometimes I dream Mama and Papa are still here. Sometimes I think if I wake up I'll see them again. But when I do, it's always just me and Sam. The cowboy didn't interrupt. He let her speak, knowing that words often carried some of the weight away. She looked up at him after a long pause. Do you think people like us can ever be safe again? The cowboy stared into the fire. Safe ain't something the West gives easy, he said slowly. But I know this, you won't face it alone anymore. Not as long as I'm breathing. Clara's eyes glistened. She didn't say anything more, but she leaned a little closer to the warmth of the fire, her heart carrying a hope it hadn't felt in a long time. The cowboy sat quietly, his mind heavy. He knew the days ahead wouldn't be simple. Taking care of 2 children meant harder choices, longer roads, and risks he hadn't faced before. But none of that frightened him as much as the thought of walking away. That he knew he could never do, so he made the choice right there beneath the stars. These children were his responsibility now. Their story had become his story, and no matter how rough the West became, he would fight to keep them alive, fed, and safe. As the fire burned low and the night stretched long, the cowboy kept his eyes on the stars. Somewhere out there, he thought, maybe their parents were watching. Maybe they would find peace knowing someone had stepped forward when the world had turned its back. And in his heart, the cowboy felt something shift. For the first time in years, he wasn't just a man wandering the open land. He was a protector, a guardian. And though it frightened him more than any outlaw ever had, it also gave him a sense of purpose he thought he had lost forever. The night passed slowly in the old barn, and by dawn the cowboy was still awake, listening to the soft breathing of the children as they slept under the blanket he had given them. Clara's arm was draped protectively over her brother, and even in sleep she looked tense, like she was afraid he might disappear if she loosened her hold. The cowboy's chest felt heavy watching them. He had come across many things in the wide West, storms, rustlers, and hungry coyotes, but nothing had struck him as hard as seeing 2 children clinging to each other in the ruins of a place that barely stood upright. When the sun pushed its golden light through the cracks in the barn walls, the cowboy rose. He stretched his stiff muscles, then stepped outside. The land was quiet, the kind of quiet that made a man think about the choices that brought him to this moment. He had lived a free life, answering to no one but himself. Yet now, in the silence of morning, he felt tied to something greater. He wasn't sure if it was duty or kindness or simply the memory of his own past. But he knew one thing for certain. He couldn't leave them. When he came back inside, Clara was awake. She sat up quickly, brushing dust from her dress, her eyes wide with uncertainty. Sam stirred beside her, rubbing his tired eyes. Clara's first instinct was to check if the cowboy was still there, as though part of her expected him to vanish like everyone else who had once promised to help. When she saw him, relief softened her face. "Morning," he said in his steady voice. Clara nodded, though she didn't smile. "Morning," she whispered back. The cowboy handed her a canteen of water. "Drink up, then give some to your brother. We'll need our strength." Her eyebrows lifted slightly. "Our strength?" He met her gaze. "I'm not leaving you here. You and Sam are coming with me. We'll find a place better than this barn, a place where you don't have to steal just to eat." Clara stared at him, her mouth opening but no words coming out. She hugged the canteen to her chest, trying to understand what he had just said. It was as if someone had lifted a heavy stone from her heart, but she was almost too scared to believe it. Sam's small voice broke the silence. "Are we going to have a home?" The cowboy's jaw tightened and his eyes softened. "We'll make one," he said firmly. For the first time, Sam smiled, weak but real. Clara's eyes filled with tears, though she blinked them back quickly. She didn't want to cry. Not in front of him. Not when strength was all she had left to give. The cowboy spent the morning gathering what little they had. Clara carried the blanket. Sam clutched the pouch of beans, even though it was nearly empty. And the cowboy loaded his saddle with the rest of his gear. He lifted Sam onto the horse first, then helped Clara climb up behind him. He walked beside them, leading the horse slowly across the plains. As they traveled, the children began to relax little by little. The vast land no longer felt like an endless trap to them. It felt like the beginning of something new. Clara still kept one arm around her brother, but her eyes were no longer filled with the same constant fear. Sam leaned against her, comforted by the steady rhythm of the horse's steps. By midday, they stopped near a small stream to rest. The cowboy filled the canteens and caught a rabbit, cooking it over a quick fire. Clara and Sam ate quietly, but the color slowly began returning to their cheeks. For the cowboy, the meal was small, but seeing them fed was enough to fill him. After they ate, Clara finally asked the question that had been burning inside her since dawn. "Why us? You could have just ridden away and never looked back." The cowboy stared at the water for a moment before answering. "Because once I was just like you. I was hungry, lost, and thought nobody cared. One man stopped for me. He gave me food, gave me hope. I swore I'd carry that with me and someday I'd pass it on. Maybe that's what I'm doing now." Clara studied him, her young mind trying to understand the weight of his words. She had spent so long feeling invisible, unwanted, and now here was a man who looked at her and saw something worth saving. Her heart ached, but not from hunger. This time it was from hope. They rested a while longer, then continued toward the nearest town. The cowboy knew it wasn't perfect. Towns were full of hard men, quick tempers, and little patience for strangers. But it was better than leaving the children in a rotting barn. They needed a roof, food, and maybe even someone who could help him figure out what came next. By the time they reached the edge of town, the sun was dipping low again. People turned their heads as the cowboy led his horse down the main street, 2 children riding with him. Whispers followed them, but the cowboy ignored it. He guided the horse toward the small inn, a place he had stayed before. The innkeeper, a stout woman with sharp eyes, came to the door. She looked at the children, then at the cowboy. "What's this?" she asked. "Travelers," the cowboy replied simply. "Need a roof and a warm meal for the night." The woman raised an eyebrow but said nothing more. She stepped aside, and soon Clara and Sam were sitting at a wooden table with bowls of stew in front of them. The cowboy sat across from them, watching as they ate slowly this time, no longer driven by wild desperation. When the meal was done and the children had been shown to a small room, Clara paused in the doorway. She looked back at the cowboy, her eyes shimmering. "Thank you," she whispered. The cowboy tipped his hat, his throat too tight to speak. Later that night, as he sat alone by the window of his room, he thought about everything that had happened. He had set out yesterday expecting nothing more than a simple supper by the fire. Instead, his world had been turned upside down by a hungry girl and her story. Her pain had shattered him, but in that breaking, something new had been built inside him, a purpose, a reason to keep going beyond his own survival. Out on the street, the wind carried the dust of the open land, but inside the inn, 2 children slept in real beds for the first time in months. That thought filled the cowboy with a quiet strength he hadn't felt in years. He knew the road ahead would be hard. He didn't have all the answers, and the West wasn't going to suddenly become kind. But he also knew this: Clara and Sam weren't alone anymore. He had chosen to stand with them, and that choice meant everything. As the stars filled the sky outside, the cowboy whispered to himself, "We're a family now, whether we planned it or not." And deep down, he knew that was the truth. What began with stolen bread had become something much greater. The cowboy wasn't just a wanderer anymore, he was their protector, their guide, their hope. And in return, they had given him something he hadn't realized he was missing: a reason to believe in tomorrow.